Hey guys, tonight we're embarking on a journey into one of the strangest chapters of religious and political history. A tale where saints wore crowns, spiritual fathers wielded armies, and the holiest man in Christendom occasionally acted more like a medieval soap opera character than a shepherd of souls. We begin our descent into the eccentric, chaotic, and scandal-drenched saga of the medieval papacy. A throne that promised divine authority, but more often delivered power struggles, betrayals, and the occasional brothel scandal. So before you settle in, go ahead and dim the lights, wrap yourself in something cozy, and let the hum of the fan lull you into a state of restful curiosity. Because tonight, we're going far beyond sermons and stained glass into a world where popes gambled, cursed their enemies, and in more than one case, brought entire kingdoms to their knees. When you hear the word Pope, what image comes to mind? Perhaps a serene, white-robed figure blessing a sea of pilgrims from a high balcony, a gentle reminder of humility, prayer, and sacrifice. But the truth, especially in the Middle Ages, rarely aligned with that vision. In fact, it often took a detour through greed, warfare, and familial dynasties playing chess with the keys to heaven. For much of medieval Europe, the papal seat wasn't just a spiritual position. It was a golden throne perched atop a mountain of political influence, military might, and very worldly wealth. In theory, the Pope was God's emissary on earth, the spiritual guide for millions, a man of unmatched moral authority. In practice, however, the office often operated like the crown jewel of Europe's power struggle. Popes were not always theologians chosen for their piety or wisdom. Frequently, they were sons of noble families, shuttled into clerical life because they weren't strong enough for battle or politically useful enough to inherit land. The church, to them, was less a calling and more a career ladder, complete with armor, income, and the power to crown or condemn emperors. By the 10th century, the papacy had become an irresistible prize in a game played by aristocratic clans. Families vied for control, not just to influence church doctrine, but to command armies, oversee vast territories, and amass fortunes. The pope could excommunicate a king, approve a war, or legitimize a ruler's claim to the throne. That level of control made the office too tempting for the devout alone. It attracted the cunning, the ambitious, and occasionally, the reckless. Take, for example, one particularly jaw-dropping chapter in this long, twisted saga, the papacy of John III. In the year 955, an 18-year-old Roman noble named Octavian ascended to the highest office in the Christian world. To appear more papal, he took the name John the 12th to be exact, a move that could hardly disguise the fact that he was still a teenager who had never known a day of hardship or penance in his life. He hadn't studied deeply in theology or spent his youth in quiet prayer. Instead, he had inherited connections, and those connections had bulldozed his way into the throne of St. Peter. What followed was less a reign than a carnival of unchecked indulgence. The young pope treated the papal palace as his private playground. He squandered church funds on gambling, hosted lavish feasts where wine flowed like water, and reportedly toasted to gods that had long since vanished from Roman worship. Church property was exchanged for favors. Sacred halls echoed with laughter, not of monks in contemplation, but of revelers and mistresses. He wasn't just spiritually negligent, he was dangerous. John had no qualms about turning political disputes into personal vendettas. Stories circulated of mutilated opponents, a man's tongue removed here, another's eyes gouged out there. And when his political scheme spiraled out of control, he turned to Emperor Otto I of Germany for military assistance, only to betray him almost as soon as the dust settled. That kind of duplicity would have been shocking for a baron. For a pope, it was cataclysmic. John's reign ended in appropriately sordid fashion. In 964, he died suddenly, some say from a stroke during an illicit encounter with a married woman. Others whisper it was less divine retribution and more a furious husband wielding something heavier than holy rage. Regardless, the young pope's life came to an abrupt and humiliating close, and the church was left to clean up the spiritual and political wreckage he had wrought. His papacy, as outrageous as it was, didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was the symptom of a deeper malaise. The spiritual throne of the Christian world had become a prize in a secular game, and the rules of that game were being rewritten not by saints, but by warlords, nobles, and scheming cardinals. John IV was only the beginning. As the echoes of John XIV's scandalous reign faded into the annals of shame, one might assume the church would course correct, perhaps install a sober-minded bishop, a man of prayer and asceticism. But this was the Middle Ages, and if there was one rule, it was that things could always get worse. Enter Benedict, sire. If John XIII was the reckless youth who stumbled into power, Benedict was the hereditary tenant who refused to leave the premises, no matter how many times he was evicted. Benedict IX didn't merely become pope once. He managed the astonishing feat of occupying the papacy 3 separate times, like a medieval landlord returning with spare keys after being kicked out. His first descent came in 1032, at an age that's still debated by historians. Some say 20, others argue even younger. Whichever the case, it was far too early for anyone to wield the spiritual reins of Christendom, especially someone with a flair for debauchery and a moral compass spinning wildly off-kilter. Almost immediately, whispers turned to shouts, allegations of bribery, extortion, and unholy indulgences surrounded him like incense at a corrupt altar. There were rumors, persistent, florid, and likely grounded in truth, of orgiastic feasts within sacred spaces, of wild animals roaming the papal grounds, and of Benedict wielding holy authority like a weapon in a tantrum. The phrase, feasting on the sins of the flesh, wasn't metaphorical anymore. It became a desperate cry from chroniclers trying to put language to the spiritual chaos they witnessed. Eventually, even his allies recoiled. By 1044, a revolt drove him from Rome, but he wasn't done. He returned, buoyed by connections and coin, reclaiming the throne like a prince who'd only momentarily lost his crown. And then, in a plot twist that would strain the imagination of any playwright, he sold the papacy. Yes, sold it, not metaphorically, but literally. In exchange for gold and a comfortable retirement, he handed over the highest religious office in Christendom to his godfather, a man soon installed as Pope Gregory II. The Church, shocked but now almost numb to disgrace, was plunged into theological confusion. 2 popes were alive and claiming legitimacy. And Benedict, perhaps missing the trappings of power or simply bored of retirement, decided he wanted his old job back. In 1047, he stormed Rome, declared himself pope once more, and attempted to reclaim his authority like a man crashing a wedding after selling his own invitation. This time, his grip didn't last long. Emperor Henry III, exhausted by the parade of papal absurdities, finally stepped in. He deposed all the claimants and elevated Pope Clement II to end the farce. Benedict, for his part, was excommunicated, banished, and quietly disappeared from the central narrative. But he had left behind something enduring, a legacy not of doctrine or devotion, but of dysfunction. He remains the only man in recorded history to treat the papacy as a revolving door and a retirement plan. What made Benedict's story so remarkable wasn't just the sin, but the sheer audacity of it. Here was a man who, despite repeated expulsion, despite selling his title, despite the outrage of both clergy and laity, still believed he could walk back into the throne room of God's emissary and take his seat without shame. His papacy stands as a monument to what happens when power is inherited without wisdom, when holiness becomes a commodity, and when ambition is unchecked by conscience. But if Benedict IX showed how far a pope could fall, what came next would blur the line between farce and horror. Because sometimes the Church's enemies weren't rivals or heretics. Sometimes they were corpses. Just when one might believe the medieval Church had exhausted its capacity for chaos, Rome revealed it still had one last trick tucked in its sleeve. A trial so macabre, so deeply theatrical, it defied even the wildest imaginings of satire or sacrilege. This was not a metaphorical judgment, not a whisper campaign in the shadows. This was a courtroom scene starring a corpse. In the year 897, Pope Stephen VI, a man whose mind seemed more haunted than holy, ordered that the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, be disinterred from its tomb. Dead for nearly a year, Formosus was no longer a political threat. He had no army, no alliances. What he did have, apparently, was unfinished business in Stephen's mind. The bones of Formosus were dragged from their resting place, dressed in full papal regalia, and brought into the grand hall of the Lateran Basilica, Rome's sacred cathedral, now doubling as a theater of the grotesque. There, in front of a crowd of stunned clergy and nobles, the corpse was seated, propped upright like a puppet, its decaying hands clasping the symbols of office it no longer held. A deacon was appointed to serve as the corpse's defense attorney. Yes, someone was tasked with speaking on behalf of a rotting body, likely praying to vanish mid-sentence. The trial began. The charges were bizarre and sweeping: that Formosus had ascended the papacy illegally, that he had violated sacred canon law, and that, by implication, his entire reign had been a cosmic error. As if that weren't enough, the verdict was predictably damning. The corpse was found guilty. Its robes were torn from its brittle frame. 3 fingers of blessing were severed, and the body, stripped of dignity and papal honor, was flung unceremoniously into the Tiber River. Even by the violent standards of 9th century Rome, this was a moment of rupture. Word of the corpse trial spread like wildfire. Bishops recoiled in disbelief. Ordinary citizens who had grown accustomed to scandals rioted in shock. The Church had long flirted with excess, but this was a performance too gruesome to be ignored. The papacy no longer looked like a spiritual office or even a political machine. It looked like a madhouse. Pope Stephen VI did not enjoy the fruits of his ghoulish pageant for long. His enemies, of which there were now many, turned against him. Within months he was stripped of his title, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell. Whether it was divine judgment or mortal vengeance hardly mattered. The point had been made. There were limits, even in the age of corpse trials and papal vengeance. His successor, Pope Romanus, inherited not only a fractured church, but a spiritual credibility crisis. He quickly nullified the Cadaver Synod's rulings, attempted to recover Formosus's body from the river, and reburied him with full honors. But the stain remained. The Church, meant to offer stability and salvation, had turned into a stage for vendetta and insanity. The question on everyone's lips, whether whispered in monasteries or muttered in taverns, was this: if the shepherds of the faith were mad, what hope was there for the flock? And yet somehow, the institution endured. Perhaps because it had to. Perhaps because its roots were deep enough to survive even the most appalling winters, or perhaps because the faithful, in their desperation, could still separate the divine from the men who claimed to serve it. But if the trial of a corpse marked a nadir of papal depravity, it was far from the last absurdity to emerge from Rome. For the road ahead would only get stranger. The Church would retreat to France, get caught in a game of geopolitical tug-of-war, and at one point boast not one pope, but 3, each claiming to be the sole voice of God. As the dust settled from Rome's darker papal spectacles, the Church found itself facing a new kind of threat, less sensational, perhaps, than corpse trials or papal playboys, but no less damaging. This wasn't a crisis of scandal. It was a crisis of geography, loyalty, and identity. In the early 14th century, the papacy took an unprecedented turn. It left Rome. The year was 1309, and Pope Clement V, elected amid French influence and political pressure, quietly relocated the papal court to the southern French city of Avignon. Officially, it was for safety. Rome had become a cauldron of riots, feuds, and urban unrest, hardly the serene capital of Christendom it once claimed to be. But behind the excuse of disorder lay a deeper truth. The French crown had grown bold, and the papacy, once an independent power, now found itself entangled in the ambitions of kings. Avignon, nestled among vineyards and aristocratic estates, was a far cry from the dust and fire of Rome. Here, the popes built a luxurious court that quickly shed any pretense of spiritual austerity. The papal palace, with its banquet halls, tapestries, and imported spices, became more Versailles than Vatican. Gold poured into the treasury, but so did complaints from cardinals, pilgrims, and distant bishops who saw the shift not as reform, but betrayal. Every pope during the Avignon period just so happened to be French. Each one was backed, subtly or overtly, by the French monarchy. What had once been a Roman office, tied to centuries of tradition and apostolic symbolism, now appeared to the rest of Christendom like a glorified extension of French royal policy. The people of Rome mourned, not just the absence of power, but the absence of presence. St. Peter's Basilica stood empty. Pilgrims arrived to find hollow halls and locked doors. Spiritual authority had relocated, and with it, the soul of the church began to fracture. Then came the breaking point. In 1377, after nearly 70 years in Avignon, Pope Gregory XV made the fateful decision to return the papacy to Rome. The reunion was anything but joyous. The city had not recovered. Its factions still warred, and when Gregory died just a year later, chaos resumed with alarming speed. The Roman people, furious at the idea that yet another French pope might be installed, demanded an Italian. Their protests were not subtle. The cardinals, fearing mob violence, quickly elected Urban VI, an Italian whose temperament, it turned out, was volcanic. He alienated his allies with accusations, punished dissenters harshly, and turned the College of Cardinals against him within months. So the French faction declared his election invalid, forced, they said, under mob pressure, and chose a rival pope, Clement VII, who promptly returned to Avignon. Now there were two popes. Each claimed the other was a fraud. Each excommunicated the other, and Europe, split by politics and proximity, took sides. France, Scotland, and Spain backed Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stood with Rome. This wasn't just a theological spat. It was a rupture. Bishops didn't know whom to obey. Priests were caught in the crossfire. Salvation itself began to look suspiciously like a matter of geography. The faithful were left wondering if both popes claimed to be the true heir of Peter and both damned the other to hell, then who, exactly, was holding the keys? The Church tried to resolve the schism in 1409 at the Council of Pisa. Their brilliant solution? Fire both popes and elect a third. But neither of the originals stepped down. Now there were three men wearing the papal tiara, each declaring the others heretics. The very concept of singular spiritual leadership had shattered. The papacy, once the foundation of unity, had become a farce. Finally, in 1417, the Council of Constance managed what years of prayer and politicking could not. It forced all claimants aside and installed Pope Martin V, who returned to Rome under strict vows of reform. The schism had ended, but the damage was deep and lasting. The people had seen behind the curtain, and what they'd glimpsed was not divine wisdom, but bureaucratic bickering, national rivalry, and a papal office as vulnerable as any court in Europe. The era of multiple popes became a cautionary tale, not just of corruption, but of fragmentation. For if the one man meant to bind Christendom together could be multiplied and manipulated, then the entire foundation of ecclesiastical unity was nothing more than parchment and politics. But the worst, astonishingly, had yet to come. Because the next pope would take corruption and turn it into an empire, if there was any hope that the end of the Western Schism would restore the sanctity of the papal office, that hope was thoroughly and flamboyantly dashed by the arrival of Rodrigo Borgia. When he was elected pope in 1492, coincidentally the same year Columbus set sail, Christendom didn't gain a shepherd. It gained a strategist, a patriarch, and a master of shadows. He took the name Alexander VI, but what he built was not a papacy in the traditional sense. It was a dynasty. Rodrigo wasn't coy about his intentions. His rise was lubricated with an avalanche of bribes, backroom deals, and veiled promises. Cardinals reportedly received gifts so lavish, gold, estates, even titles, that the conclave resembled a high-stakes auction more than a spiritual election. When he emerged from the vote, the smell of incense could barely mask the stench of politics. Once enthroned, Alexander made no attempt to separate his personal ambitions from his sacred office. He didn't just acknowledge his children, he elevated them. His most notorious offspring, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, became the cornerstones of his legacy. Cesare, once a cardinal, shed his red robes for armor and began carving out territory in central Italy like a warlord in cassock. Lucrezia, meanwhile, moved through a series of strategic marriages, each one calculated to expand Borgia influence. Rumors followed her everywhere, tales of poison, incest, secret lovers. But whether truth or smear, the effect was the same. The Borgias became mythic, dangerous, and unforgettable. The Vatican under Alexander was no sanctuary. It was a court, lavish, glittering, and brazenly opulent. Banquets turned into masked balls. Political enemies disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Whispers of poisonings trailed every diplomatic dinner. And through it all, the Pope sat at the center, not ashamed, not defensive, but proud. He had, in his view, elevated the Church, not to greater piety, but to unmatched power. His critics seethed, of course. Preachers in Florence thundered about damnation. Foreign monarchs plotted and murmured. But Alexander's grip was ironclad. He played France and Spain against one another, promised spiritual rewards in exchange for temporal loyalty, and kept his enemies guessing. He wasn't trying to be loved. He was trying to win. And in many ways, he did. The papal coffers swelled. The Borgia name became synonymous with fear and authority. The Vatican's infrastructure expanded, funded by clever taxation and aggressive diplomacy. If the papacy was a business, Alexander ran it like a seasoned executive, with a dagger behind his back and a ledger in hand. Yet even for a man like Alexander, there were limits. He died in 1503, likely from malaria, though some claimed poison, perhaps even intended for someone else. In death, as in life, his name divided opinions. Was he a savior of the papal state or its greatest shame? A visionary or a villain? Perhaps both. His legacy endured not in dogma, but in spectacle, and in his children, especially Cesare, who would carry the torch of ambition far beyond the grave of his father. For when your family name has been etched into the very stones of Rome, through scandal, strategy, and whispered curses, your story doesn't end with a funeral. It continues with blood, betrayal, and the slow decay of reputation. Because in the Renaissance, power was eternal, but morality was optional. When your father is the most powerful man in Christendom, and also one of the most controversial, you do not grow up quietly. Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia were not simply the children of a pope. They were the twin pillars of a dynasty built on ambition, intrigue, and blood. Rome whispered their names, not in reverence, but with fascination and fear, as though the very air around them carried the scent of poison and perfume. Cesare was the first to step into the spotlight. Handsome, charismatic, and utterly ruthless, he was made a cardinal at just 18. It was a strange fit, red robes on a man who longed not for sermons, but for swords. The ecclesiastical life chafed against his skin, and when the opportunity came, he cast it off like a costume. He renounced his office, donned armor, and set off to carve out an empire of his own, funded naturally by the Vatican's overflowing coffers. His campaigns through central Italy were swift and brutal. Cities fell before him like dominoes. Rivals vanished, sometimes in chains, sometimes in rivers. Cesare was not just a soldier. He was a tactician, a master of psychological warfare, a man who understood that fear could win battles before the first blade was drawn. His enemies called him a butcher. His allies called him a genius. And Pope Alexander, his father, watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and calculation. Then there was Lucrezia. History has not been kind to her. For centuries, she was cast as a villainess in silks, a poisoner with a golden smile. But the truth is more elusive. What is known is that she was married off repeatedly, each time for political advantage. Her first marriage was annulled. Her second husband was found dead under mysterious circumstances, stabbed in a courtyard, left to bleed in the shadows. The third stuck, allowing her to become Duchess of Ferrara and a respected patron of the arts. Whether she played the role of manipulator or pawn, or some combination of both, depends entirely on the chronicler. Rumors swirled endlessly around the Borgia siblings. Whispers of incest, hidden pregnancies, lovers murdered beneath Vatican trapdoors. Some of it was slander, crafted by political enemies desperate to tarnish a family that had risen too far, too fast. But in a world where perception was power, the rumors became their own kind of truth. Together, Cesare and Lucrezia blurred the lines between nobility and criminality, between royalty and racketeering. They moved through the courts of Europe like shadows, elegant, dangerous, impossible to ignore. They were living proof that the papacy was no longer just a seat of spiritual guidance, but the throne of a secular empire with blood on its altar and gold beneath its floorboards. And through it all, Pope Alexander watched with the weary pride of a father who had raised not saints, but survivors. If the church was meant to reflect the kingdom of heaven, the Borgia court had transformed it into something far more earthly, a dynasty of ambition wrapped in velvet and vice. What followed would be even louder. For if Cesare was the prince of strategy and Lucrezia the mistress of grace and rumor, the next pope would come not with subtlety, but with steel. After the theatrical spectacle of the Borgias, the Vatican might have sought calm, perhaps a man of quiet reflection, someone who could wash away the stains of excess and scandal with humility. Instead, it received Giuliano della Rovere, a man who looked at the throne of St. Peter and saw not a seat of prayer, but a war horse. Crowned Pope Julius II in 1503, he came not with incense and hymns, but with armor strapped to his chest and a sword close at hand. He didn't just inherit the papacy, he stormed into it. Julius didn't want to retreat into quiet diplomacy. He wanted to reclaim lost territory, crush rebellious cities, and remind every noble, prince and pretender that the papacy was not to be trifled with. He wasn't content to speak with the voice of God. He wanted to ride at the head of his army. Nicknamed the Warrior Pope, Julius didn't just issue commands from a gilded chamber. He led troops into battle himself, clad in gleaming plate, riding through mud and smoke with the fervor of a man possessed, not by the Holy Spirit, but by a deep, relentless drive for political dominance. Where previous popes had fought battles of doctrine, Julius waged literal wars. He raised armies, built fortifications, and personally oversaw sieges as if Rome's salvation depended not on sermons, but on cannon fire. Yet for all his militarism, Julius harbored a passion equally fierce for art. Beneath the steel and the fury, he dreamed of a Rome reborn in marble and color. It was Julius who dragged Michelangelo into the Sistine Chapel, handed him a paintbrush, and ordered the ceiling to become a celestial masterpiece. Michelangelo, more sculptor than painter, balked at the task, but Julius would not hear protest. When the artist hesitated, the Pope climbed the scaffolding himself to shout demands face to face. That same passion funded Raphael's frescoes, Bramante's architectural marvels, and the early foundations of a rebuilt St. Peter's Basilica. Julius saw himself as a Roman emperor reincarnated, a patron of glory and conquest, both martial and aesthetic. His reign was loud, expensive, and brimming with contradictions. He prayed with one hand and plotted with the other. He championed artistic beauty while orchestrating brutal campaigns. He wielded the cross and the sword with equal zeal. To his critics, Julius was the final break from the Church's spiritual roots. A pope who had transformed the sacred into the secular, the divine into the imperial. But to others, he was exactly what the papacy needed: strength, vision, and the ability to command respect in an era of shifting alliances and encroaching threats. He died in 1513, not from battle wounds as many expected, but of natural causes, perhaps the only anticlimactic detail in a life defined by grand gestures. He left behind a papal state expanded by force, a Rome adorned in beauty, and a church once again tangled in the duality of heaven and earth. But if Julius ruled like a general, his successor would glide in like a prince, soft-footed, silk-cloaked, and singing madrigals. When Giuliano della Rovere, Pope Julius II, died, the thunder of war quieted, and in its place came music, feasting, and the rustle of silk. His successor was not a general. He was a prince. Giovanni de' Medici, heir to one of Florence's wealthiest and most cultured families, became Pope Leo X. Where Julius had charged into battle clad in armor, Leo entered the papal palace like a man walking into a private salon. He was young, refined, and aristocratic to his fingertips. He had grown up among sculptures and sonnets, philosophers and financiers. His idea of piety was beauty. His idea of governance was pageantry. Upon his election in 1513, Leo is reported to have said, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." It was not so much a mission statement as a confession, and enjoy it he did. The Vatican became the most elegant court in Europe, a whirl of banquets, theater, rare animals, and endless displays of Renaissance excess. Leo's beloved pet elephant, Hanno, was housed in a custom-built marble stable and fed fruit from silver platters. Entertainers, poets, and painters flocked to his court. It was said that the halls of the Vatican echoed not with prayers, but with madrigals and laughter. Under Leo, the papacy transformed into a mirror of Medici Florence, a kingdom of art, culture, and opulence. But pleasure comes at a cost. The papal treasury, already strained by Julius's military campaigns and construction projects, groaned under the weight of Leo's entertainments. Debts mounted. Gold bled out of Rome faster than it arrived, and so Leo turned to an ancient tool of papal fundraising: indulgences. These were official certificates promising remission from purgatorial punishment in exchange for a monetary donation. They had existed for centuries, but under Leo, the system exploded into something dangerously close to spiritual commerce. Priests were dispatched across Europe to sell forgiveness like vendors in a market, promising salvation in exchange for coin. For Leo, it was business. For many Christians, it began to feel like a betrayal. One German monk, deeply unsettled by what he saw, decided to speak out. His name was Martin Luther. Luther's objections were not whispered in back rooms. In 1517 he nailed 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, a public declaration of defiance. He accused the Church, and Leo by extension, of corrupting the very idea of grace. He challenged the notion that salvation could be bought, and he called for reform with a clarity and conviction that echoed across Europe. At first, Leo dismissed him. He called Luther a drunken German who would change his mind when sober. But Luther did not recant. He gathered followers, he published pamphlets, he spoke not just as a scholar, but as a man burning with the belief that the Church had lost its way. Eventually, Leo excommunicated him in 1521. But the fire had already spread. The Protestant Reformation had begun. Leo would not live to see the full collapse of Catholic unity, but he had lit the fuse. Whether by negligence or hubris, he had underestimated the hunger for reform and overestimated the power of ceremony and tradition to hold it all together. He died that same year, reportedly of pneumonia, though some whispered it was the result of overeating. If so, it was a fitting end for a pope whose reign was defined by indulgence in every sense, culinary, cultural, and ecclesiastical. Pope Leo X did not mean to break the Church. He merely wanted to enjoy it. But in trying to make Rome a stage for art and elegance, he forgot that beneath the golden frescoes there were cracks, and that sometimes a single hammer blow is all it takes to shatter a world. Long before microscopes or germ theory, before anatomy labs or antibiotics, the human body was a mystery best explained by metaphor. In the ancient world, and well into the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't science in the modern sense. It was philosophy, intuition, and tradition woven together into a framework known as the theory of humours. It began in ancient Greece with Hippocrates and later Galen, who proposed that the body was governed by 4 essential fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each had its own character, its own elemental ties. Blood was warm and wet, aligned with spring and joy. Yellow bile was hot and dry, the fuel of anger. Black bile, cold and dry, dragged the soul toward melancholy. Phlegm, cold and wet, dulled the senses and calmed the nerves. These weren't just bodily fluids. They were believed to shape your temperament, dictate your moods, even control your destiny. A man who laughed easily and lived boldly was said to be sanguine, filled with blood. A quiet, brooding scholar might be melancholic, too much black bile in the system. Medicine, in this model, was less about diagnosis and more about balance. Health was harmony. Illness was disharmony, the result of one humor overpowering the others. And so, when the body ached or the spirit faltered, the solution was simple: restore balance. That might mean adjusting your diet, avoiding certain seasons, or undergoing more aggressive measures. Vomiting, purging, sweating, and the most infamous of all, bleeding. Bloodletting became the cure-all of pre-modern medicine. It was practiced with an almost religious fervor. A headache, too much blood to the brain. Fever, blood running too hot. Depression, let the black bile drain. Physicians, monks, and even barbers kept knives and leeches on hand, ready to open a vein and let the body find its peace through the slow drip of crimson release. It didn't stop there. Elaborate charts told doctors which vein to open based on which body part ached and where the moon was in its cycle. The inner elbow for liver problems, the ankle for the spleen. Timing mattered. Zodiac signs mattered. There was a system, even if its foundation was fantasy. Yet this theory, flawed as it now seems, was not without merit in its own time. It offered structure. It insisted that sickness had internal causes, not just divine punishment or evil spirits. It encouraged observation. What color is the urine? How thick the spit? It gave medieval healers a lens, however foggy, through which to study the body. Still, the consequences were often deadly. Patients were bled into weakness, subjected to emetics and enemas that did more harm than healing. Even great figures were not spared. George Washington, centuries later, would die after having nearly half his blood drained during a routine illness, still a prisoner of humorist thinking. And yet, the theory endured. It endured not because it worked, but because it made sense. Emotionally, symbolically, culturally. It told a story people could believe, that health was balance, that suffering could be corrected, that with the right ritual, the right adjustment, the body might be set right again. In a world without antibiotics or clear answers, sometimes belief itself was the most powerful medicine. And so, for nearly 2,000 years, doctors reached not for microscopes, but for knives. Long before we discovered bacteria or isolated viruses, people believed that sickness drifted in the air, riding on invisible waves of rot. You could smell danger, they thought, decay in the gutters, foul breath from the marshes, a corpse left too long in the sun. It wasn't infection, it was pollution. This was the age of miasma. The word itself comes from the Greek miasma, meaning stain or pollution. And that's precisely how people understood it. Disease wasn't caused by organisms unseen, but by the very atmosphere becoming tainted, by breath exhaled from the sick, by vapors rising from sewage, by the spiritual rot of immoral behavior. If the world smelled wrong, you were at risk. It was a belief both terrifying and oddly logical. Cities stank, bodies piled up after plagues, swamps steamed with mystery, and when outbreaks followed the smell, the connection seemed obvious. Health, in the miasmatic view, was about environment. To stay well, you needed fresh air, fragrant herbs, distance from decay. During the Black Death, physicians roamed the streets in beaked masks, those now iconic symbols of plague. The beaks weren't decorative. They were stuffed with spices, rose petals, camphor, anything to shield the doctor from the pestilence they believed floated through the air like an invisible demon. Fires were lit to purify the streets. Incense was burned in homes. Bells rang, and flowers were worn, not in mourning, but in defense. The theory wasn't confined to Europe. In India, in China, in the Islamic world, versions of miasma flourished. In ancient Sanskrit texts, illness was often blamed on bad wind. In Chinese medicine, disrupted qi could be stirred by unclean air. While the names changed, the fear remained the same. That breath itself could kill. And yet, despite being wrong in its science, miasma theory wasn't useless. In fact, it led to some of the earliest forms of public health. Cities widened streets to allow air to circulate. Sewer systems were built, not because people feared bacteria, but because they wanted to banish bad smells. Freshwater infrastructure improved. Quarantine zones were established, not because they understood contagion, but because they feared corrupted places and the air within them. In a strange twist of irony, trying to chase away imaginary poisons sometimes cleared out the real ones. The theory was flawed, but its consequences were often helpful. Miasma held sway well into the 19th century. Even after microscopes revealed a hidden microbial world, many physicians clung to the idea that it was the air, not the agent, that made people ill. When cholera ravaged London, it was blamed on the Thames's stench. Only after years of death did doctors like John Snow trace the disease not to the fog, but to the water. And yet, the ghost of miasma lingered. Even today, we associate sickness with filth and breath. We open windows when someone coughs. We light candles after illness. Deep down, we still fear that air can betray us. Because for centuries it was not the cough or the fever that brought dread, it was the smell. A sign that the world itself had turned sour, and that to survive, you needed to flee not from people, but from the very wind that touched them. In the ancient world, the line between medicine and poison was not just thin, it was invisible. The very substances that could bring relief might also kill, and healers walked this razor's edge with a confidence born of desperation and symbolism. They prescribed treatments not because they understood their chemistry, but because they believed in their power. And at the top of this treacherous list was mercury. Mercury, the liquid metal that shimmered like magic, captivated physicians from China to Rome. In Taoist alchemical texts, it was believed to contain the secret of immortality. Mixed into pills, tinctures, or powders, it was consumed by emperors and sages, hoping to extend their lives beyond the mortal coil. But instead of eternal youth, it delivered tremors, madness, and excruciating death. The first emperor of a unified China, Qin Shi Huang, may have succumbed not to battle or illness, but to a steady diet of mercury meant to preserve his life forever. He died young, sick, and delusional, surrounded by alchemists who believed they had the key to heaven sealed in a bottle of poison. The West was no less enchanted. The Greeks and Romans used mercury to purge the body, disinfect wounds, and treat skin diseases. Later, during the Islamic Golden Age and into medieval Europe, mercury became the preferred weapon against syphilis, a disease spreading silently through the population. Sufferers were doused, injected, and fumigated with mercury vapors. The results were horrific. Patients drooled, lost teeth, suffered neurological breakdowns. But if the symptoms of the disease faded for a time, the treatment was declared a success, and mercury was only the beginning. There was mandrake, a root shaped vaguely like the human form. Harvested at night and surrounded by legends of deadly screams, it was prized as an anesthetic and aphrodisiac, but it was also hallucinogenic and potentially lethal. Doctors, nonetheless, ground it into powder and mixed it with opium to sedate patients before primitive surgeries. If the screams were metaphorical, the danger was not. Lead found its way into everything. Roman winemakers boiled grape must in lead pots to create a sweet syrup, unwittingly poisoning generations. Cosmetics, paints, and salves used lead as a base, and when people grew sick, no one blamed the shimmering powders they applied to their skin or the wine they drank with every meal. Lead, like mercury, didn't look dangerous. It looked beautiful. Even crocodile dung had a place in the medicine cabinet. In ancient Egypt, it was mixed into contraceptive pastes. Women inserted it, hoping for divine protection and earthly prevention. It was foul, unsanitary, and utterly ineffective, but no more strange, perhaps, than the powdered mummies that Europeans would later consume as medicine, believing the embalmed flesh of the dead contained healing magic. These treatments weren't merely dangerous, they were fatal. But they were also born of a logic that made sense to the people who trusted them. In a world without microscopes, the body was a map of symbols. Strong smells meant power. Strange colors meant magic. And if something caused a reaction, whether a purge, a sweat, or a delirious high, it had to be doing something important. It's easy to look back in horror. But woven into these deadly practices is a very human thread, the willingness to try anything, to grasp at hope, to fight suffering with whatever the world offered, be it root, metal, or myth. When we think of ancient Egypt, we think of pyramids, golden sarcophagi, and linen-wrapped mummies lying silent through the centuries. But behind the rituals of death lay something unexpected. A glimpse into how the Egyptians saw the human body, what they thought made it live, and how they hoped to preserve it forever. To the Egyptians, immortality wasn't a vague promise. It was a blueprint. They believed the soul could only journey into the afterlife if the body remained intact. And so, over centuries, they perfected one of the most sophisticated embalming processes in history. Organs were removed with surgical precision. The body was dried with natron salts. Skin was anointed with oils, and the final product, wrapped in linen, sealed in a coffin, and guarded by spells, was not just a corpse. It was a vessel of eternal hope. Oddly, their understanding of anatomy, while shaped by spiritual goals, was often more advanced than their medical theories. Embalmers knew where to find the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the liver. They had to. Each was extracted, purified, and stored in canopic jars. They recognized the structure of muscles, the pathways of veins, the resilience of bone. But function was another matter entirely. In a strange twist, the brain, arguably the most complex organ, was considered useless. It was removed through the nose with a hooked tool, discarded like waste. Meanwhile, the heart was treated with sacred reverence. Egyptians believed it was the seat of thought, memory, and emotion, the very core of a person's soul. During judgment in the afterlife, the heart would be weighed against a feather. Too heavy with sin, and the soul would be devoured. Too light, and paradise awaited. Their view of illness followed a similar logic. Disease, they believed, flowed from spiritual imbalance, angry gods, or blockages in the body's hidden channels. Remedies were a blend of the practical and the magical. Honey to fight infection, incantations to drive out malevolent forces, and amulets to guard the soul. A physician might recommend castor oil for digestion in one breath, and in the next, prescribe a spell to be chanted at sunset. Even death itself wasn't the end of healing. Mummified remains were sometimes ground into powders and sold as medicine. Known as mumia, these grisly concoctions were used well into medieval Europe, thought to cure everything from headaches to internal bleeding. People swallowed dust from embalmed kings in the hope that a touch of eternity might settle in their veins. But the Egyptians were not without reason. Their medical texts, like the Ebers Papyrus, catalogued hundreds of treatments, some rooted in observation, others in tradition. They knew the antibacterial power of honey. They used moldy bread on wounds, unknowingly anticipating penicillin. And while their view of the body was framed by religion, their techniques showed attention to detail that bordered on clinical. In Egypt, medicine and magic were never separate. Healing the body meant honoring the gods. Preserving the dead meant preparing for divine reunion. And understanding life, however imperfectly, began with taking the body apart, carefully, reverently, one sacred organ at a time. In a world still tangled in mysticism, where medicine often relied on charms, bleeding, or divine intervention, there rose a figure whose mind shone like a lantern in the dark. Born in 980 CE, in a village near Bukhara, modern-day Uzbekistan, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, became not only a physician, but a philosopher, astronomer, and poet. And most of all, a synthesizer of knowledge. He didn't merely inherit Greek medical wisdom. He tamed it. From Hippocrates, he took the notion of humoral balance. From Galen, the encyclopedic obsession with anatomy. But Avicenna brought order to their chaos. Where others collected ideas, he constructed a system. Where others speculated, he experimented. By his early 20s, he was already treating noblemen, writing treatises and gaining access to libraries usually reserved for the court elite. His greatest work, The Canon of Medicine, became one of the most important medical texts in history. For centuries, across both the Islamic world and medieval Europe, it served as the foundation of medical education. It was, in essence, medicine's first true textbook. The canon didn't just list remedies. It organized disease, explored symptoms, outlined treatments, and stressed the importance of diagnosis based on observation, not superstition. He described hundreds of drugs and warned against using too many at once. He emphasized the role of environment and diet. Healing, in Avicenna's eyes, wasn't just about the body. It was about balance, of air, of food, of the mind. And while he still believed in the four humors, he applied their theory with a clarity no one before him had achieved. He tied temperaments to physical traits and tailored treatment accordingly. His version of humoral theory became less myth and more model, a way to structure care rather than explain it all away. His insights often bordered on the prophetic. He suggested that diseases could be spread through contaminated water, soil, and air. He urged isolation of the sick. Centuries before quarantine became a medical term. He hinted at the idea that small, unseen agents might transmit illness. Germ theory was far in the future, but Avicenna had already cracked the door open. Perhaps most remarkably, the canon outlined rules for drug testing that sound eerily modern. He believed that any medicine should be tested on healthy subjects before being used on the sick, and that trials should be repeated, measured, and controlled. In an age where hope often replaced proof, Avicenna demanded evidence. But he was not without contradictions. Like many of his time, he still clung to astrology, believing celestial alignments influenced human health. He wrote about alchemy and the medicinal potential of gold. Yet beneath those echoes of older beliefs was a mind anchored in inquiry. In the Islamic world, he was revered as a sage. In Europe, he was treated almost like scripture. For hundreds of years, his canon was required reading in medical schools from Italy to Spain. Latin translations of his work flowed through monasteries and lecture halls, providing structure to a profession that had long groped in the dark. Avicenna didn't banish the myths, but he helped medicine shed its skin. He moved it from incantation to investigation, from scattered knowledge to structured wisdom. His work marked a turning point, not because he was always right, but because he taught others to ask better questions. In an era where truth often bowed to tradition, Avicenna gave medicine a spine and a path forward. If Hippocrates was the father of medicine, then Galen was its ruler, commanding, prolific, and almost untouchable. Born in 129 CE in the Roman Empire, Galen lived during a time when medicine still balanced on the edge between philosophy and practice. But unlike his predecessors, Galen wasn't content to theorize from a distance. He wanted to understand the body from the inside out, literally. He began his career as a physician to gladiators, stitching wounds and setting bones amid the blood and dust of the arena. It was here, amidst broken ribs and torn flesh, that he gained first-hand knowledge of anatomy. But Rome forbade human dissection, and so Galen turned to animals. He dissected apes, pigs, and dogs. He cut nerves, observed spasms, recorded every movement, every tremor. He learned much, but not always what he thought. From these observations, Galen created a vast, sweeping system of medicine. He believed the liver produced blood, that it flowed not in a circuit, but seeped quietly through invisible holes in the heart. He thought the brain cooled the blood like a radiator. He described organs with poetic confidence, wrong often, but convincing. These weren't small errors. They were structural flaws. Myths passed off as mechanics. And because Galen wrote prolifically, and in a style that combined science with philosophy and moral instruction, his ideas became scripture. To contradict him wasn't just wrong, it was heresy. For centuries, no one dared question the man who had written hundreds of texts, who had treated emperors, who had explained everything from fevers to emotions within a neat, humoral framework. Galen's system was so thorough, so elegant, that it became a cage. Every new observation had to fit within it, or be dismissed. In the Islamic world, Galen's texts were translated and preserved, treated with reverence. In medieval Europe, they became part of the formal curriculum. Students didn't learn to dissect, they learned to confirm. If a body differed from Galen's account, then the body was wrong. But Galen wasn't a fool. He conducted experiments, used logic, and believed deeply in observation. His ambition wasn't to deceive, it was to create a unified theory of life. And in many ways, he succeeded. He catalogued symptoms. He stressed the importance of prognosis. He treated patients holistically, as beings shaped by environment, diet, and emotion. Still, his dominance became a barrier to progress. It wasn't until the Renaissance, over 1,000 years later, that physicians like Andreas Vesalius dared to challenge him. Through human dissection, they revealed Galen's mistakes. The heart had chambers, but no holes. The liver did not make blood, the brain did not merely cool it. And yet, for all his missteps, Galen gave medicine something it desperately needed: structure, vocabulary, ambition. He tried to make sense of the body when few others dared. He didn't just describe illness, he tried to explain why it happened and what could be done about it. In the end, Galen's legacy is a paradox. A man who advanced medicine so far, yet held it back for centuries, a thinker who revered reason, yet remained blinded by his own conclusions. His story is a warning of brilliance that becomes dogma, and of the danger in believing that any one man has all the answers. But it's also a tribute to the relentless human desire to understand what lies beneath the skin. In the West, the body was a battlefield of fluids. In the East, it was a landscape of energy, delicate, dynamic, and deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world. For over 2,000 years, Chinese medicine shaped its own understanding of health and illness, one not based on blood or bile, but on something unseen, qi. Qi, often translated as life force or vital energy, was believed to flow through the body along hidden pathways called meridians. These meridians didn't follow blood vessels or nerves. They were more conceptual than anatomical, weaving a network of energy through every organ, joint, and muscle. When qi flowed smoothly, the body was in balance. When it was blocked, weakened, or chaotic, illness appeared. Not just physical, but emotional and spiritual too. And so, the goal of healing was not to fight disease, but to restore harmony. That's where acupuncture came in. This ancient practice, still used today, involved inserting slender needles into specific points on the body, tiny openings in the meridian grid, meant to release trapped qi, redirect its flow, or strengthen its movement. Pain in the shoulder. Insert a needle in the ankle. Nausea. Tap a point near the wrist. To the uninitiated, it seemed arbitrary. But to the practitioner, it was a language, one of subtle balance, tension, and release. The origins of acupuncture can be traced to one of the foundational texts of Chinese medicine, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, written over 2 millennia ago. It outlined not just the locations of meridians and acupuncture points, but how they connected to the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, and the ever-shifting forces of yin and yang. Unlike Galen's dissected bodies, Chinese medicine wasn't about parts. It was about patterns. Diagnosis involved the tongue, the pulse, the skin, the sound of the voice. A skilled physician could gather volumes from the color of the patient's face or the rhythm of their breath. Every symptom was a clue, not of a singular problem, but of an imbalance in the entire system, and acupuncture was rarely used in isolation. It was part of a broader tapestry. Herbal remedies crafted with precision, cupping to draw toxins from the skin, moxibustion, burning herbs near the body to warm and stimulate qi. Diet was medicine. Emotion was medicine. Environment, behavior, even the seasons could shift a person's internal energy. For centuries, Western science scoffed. Where were the meridians on the cadaver? Where was the proof in blood or tissue? But as the 20th century progressed, curiosity replaced mockery. Studies began to show that acupuncture could influence the nervous system, reduce pain, calm the body. The results were often subtle, but they were real. Perhaps acupuncture worked not by restoring invisible energy, but by stimulating nerves, boosting endorphins, relaxing muscles. Perhaps the meridians were metaphors, not maps, but that didn't make them useless. Because what traditional Chinese medicine understood, perhaps better than its Western counterpart, was that healing isn't just about chemicals or cuts. It's about listening. To the body, yes, but also to the rhythm of life around it. In that world, illness was not just something to be removed. It was a signal, a whisper from within that something had fallen out of step. And healing, then, was about remembering how to move in tune again.